The Blue Island by W.T. Stead. Read for you by BlueFriend in beautiful BC. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Experience of a new arrival beyond the veil. Many years ago, I was attracted by an article on the subject of spirit communication, and after reading it carefully several times, I was forced to admit its soundness. I was struck by the plain and practical ideas of the writer. This was the first cause of my becoming actively interested in this big and amazing work. From that time onward, I did all in my power to prove and then forward the movement. Many people know this, and those who do not can become acquainted with the details if they wish. Therefore, I'm going to pass at once from my first earth interest in the occult to my first interest in the earth. Just as I was overcome with astonishment and satisfaction on first reaching conviction on earth, so was I astonished almost equally on my coming to this land, and finding that my knowledge of this subject gained on earth was strikingly correct in nearly all the chief points. There was a great satisfaction in proving this. I was at once amazed and delighted to find so much truth in all I had learned, for although I had believed implicitly, I was not entirely without grave misgivings upon many minor details. Hence, my general satisfaction when I recognized things and features which, though I had accepted whilst on earth, I had scarcely anticipated would be as I now found them. This must sound somewhat contradictory, but I want you to understand that my earthly misgivings were based on fear that perhaps the spirit world had a formula of its own which was quite different from our earthly mentality, and that therefore that many points were transmitted to us in such a form and in such expression as we on earth would be able to grasp and appreciate, and were not in themselves the precise descriptions, owing to the limitations of earth word expression. Of my actual passing from earth to spirit life, I do not wish to write more than a few lines. I've already spoken of it several times and in several places. The first part of it was, naturally, an extremely discordant one, but from the time my physical life was ended, there was no longer that sense of struggling with overwhelming odds. But I do not wish to speak about that. My first surprise came when, I now understand that to your way of thinking I was dead, I found I was in a position to help people. From being in dire straits myself to being able to lend a hand to others was such a sudden transition that I was frankly and blankly surprised. I was so taken aback that I did not consider the why and the wherefore at all. I was suddenly able to help. I knew not how or why, and did not attempt to inquire. There was no analysis then. That came a little later. I was also surprised to find a number of friends with me. People I knew had passed over years before. That was the first cause of my realizing that change had taken place. I knew it suddenly, and was a trifle alarmed. Practically instantaneously, I found myself looking for myself. Just a moment of agitation, momentary only, and then the full and glorious realization that all that I had learned was true. Oh, how badly I needed a telephone at that moment. I felt I could give some papers some headlines for the evening. That was my first realization, and then came a helplessness, a reaction, a thought of all my own at home. They didn't know it yet. What would they think of me? Here was I, with my telephone out of working order for the present. I was still so near to the earth that I could see everything going on there. Where I was, I could see the wrecked ship, the people, the whole scene. That seemed to pull me into action. I could help, and so in a few seconds, though I'm now taking a long time to tell you, it was only a few seconds really, I found myself changed from the helpless state to one of action. Helpful, not helpless, was helpful too, I think. I pass a little now. The end came, and it was all finished with. It was like waiting for a liner to sail. We waited until all were aboard. I mean, we waited until the disaster was complete. The saved, saved. The dead, alive. Then, in one whole, we moved our scene. It was a strange method of traveling for us all, and we were a strange crew, bound for we knew not where. The whole scene was indescribably pathetic. Many, knowing what had occurred, were in agony of doubt as to their people left behind and as to their own future state. What would it hold for them? Would they be taken to see him? What would their sentence be? Others were almost mental wrecks. They knew nothing. They seemed to be uninterested in everything. Their minds were paralyzed. A strange crew indeed of human souls waiting their ratings in the new land. A matter of a few minutes in time only, and here were hundreds of bodies floating in the water, dead, hundreds of souls carried through the air, alive, very much alive, some were. Many, realizing their death had come, were enraged at their own powerlessness to save their valuables. They fought to save what they had on earth prized so much. The scene on the boat at the time of the striking was not so pleasant, but it was as nothing to the scene among the poor souls newly thrust out of their bodies. All unwillingly, it was both heartbreaking and repellent, and thus we waited until all were collected, until all were ready, and then we moved our scene to a different land. It was a curious journey, that, far more strange than anything I had anticipated. We seemed to rise vertically into the air at terrific speed. As a whole, we moved as if we were on a very large platform, and this was hurled into the air with gigantic strength and speed, yet there was no feeling of insecurity. We were quite steady. I cannot tell how long our journey lasted, nor how far from the earth we were when we arrived, but it was a gloriously beautiful arrival. It was like walking from your own Indian sky. There all was brightness and beauty. We saw this land far off when we were approaching, and those of us who could understand realized that we were being taken to the place destined for all those people who pass over suddenly on account of its general appeal. It helps the nerve-racked newcomer to fall into line and regain mental balance very quickly. We arrived feeling, in a sense, proud of ourselves. It was all lightness, brightness, everything as physical and quite as material in every way as the world that we had just finished with. Our arrival was greeted with welcomes from many old friends and relations who had been dear to each one of us in our earth life, and having arrived, we people who had come over from that ill-fated ship parted company. We were free agents again, though each one of us was in the company of some personal friends who'd been over here for a long while. Chapter 2. I have told you a little about the journey and arrival, and I want now to tell you my first impression and a few experiences. I must begin by saying I do not know how long after the collision these experiences took place. It seemed to be a continuation without any break, but I cannot be certain that this was so. I found myself in company with two old friends, one of them my father. He came to be with me, to help and generally show me around. It was like nothing else so much as merely arriving in a foreign country and having a chum to go around with. That was the principal sensation. The scene from which we had so lately come was already well relegated to the past. Having accepted the change of death, all the horror of our late experience had gone. It might have been 50 years ago instead of perhaps only last night. Consequently, our pleasure in the new land was not marred by grief at being parted from earth friends. I will not say that none were unhappy, many were, but that was because they did not understand the nearness of the two worlds. They did not know what was possible, but to those who understood the possibilities, it was, in a sense, the feeling, let us enjoy a little of this new land before mailing our news home. Therefore there was little grief in our arrival. In writing my first experiences, I'm going to give a certain amount of detail. My old sense of humor is still with me, I'm glad to say, and I know that what I have to say now will cause a certain amount of amusement to those who treat this subject lightly, but that I do not mind. I'm glad they will find something to smile at. It will make an impression on them that way, and then, when their own time comes for the change, they will recognize themselves amongst the conditions of which I'm going to write. Therefore, to that kind of skeptic I just say, "It's all right, friend. You give no offense." My father and I, with my friend also, set out immediately. A curious thing struck me. I was clothed exactly as I had been, and it seemed a little strange to me to think that I had brought my clothing with me. There's number one, Mr. Skeptic. My father was also dressed as I had always known him. Everything and everybody appeared to be quite normal, quite as on earth. We went out together and had refreshments at once, and naturally that was followed by much discussion about our mutual friends on both sides. I was able to give them news, and they gave me information about our friends and also about the conditions ruling in this new country. Another thing which struck me was the general colouring of the place. Of England it would be difficult to say what the impression of colouring is, but I suppose it would be considered grey-green. Here there was no uncertainty about the impression. It is undoubtedly a blue which predominated, a light shade of blue. I do not mean the people, trees, houses, etc. were all blue, but the general impression was that of a blue land. I commented upon this to my father, who, by the way, was considerably more active and younger than he was at the time of death. We looked more like brothers. I spoke of this impression of blue, and he explained that it was so in a sense. There was a great predominance of blue rays in the light, and that was why it was so wonderful a place for mental recovery. Now, some say, how completely foolish! And yet, the next world is only a complement of your present one. We were a quaint population in that country. There were people of all conditions, all colours, all races, all sizes, all went about freely together, but there was a great sense of caring only for oneself, self-absorption. A bad thing on earth, but a necessary thing here, both for the general and the individual good. There would be no progress or recovery in this land without it. As a result of this absorption, there was a general peace amongst these many people, and this peace would not have been attained without this self-centeredness. No one took notice of any other. Each stood for himself and was almost unaware of all the others. There were not many people whom I knew. Most of those who came to meet me had disappeared again, and I saw scarcely anyone I knew except my two companions. I was not sorry for this. It gave me more chance of appreciating all this new scene before me. There was the sea where we were, and I and my companion went for a long walk together along the shore. It was not like one of your seaside resorts with promenade and band. It was a very peaceful and lovely spot. There were some very big buildings on our right, and on our left was the sea. All was light and bright, and again this blue atmosphere was very marked. I do not know how far we went, but we talked incessantly of our new conditions, and of my own folk at home, and of the possibility of letting them know how it fared with me. And I think we must have gone a long way. If you can imagine what your world would look like if it were compressed into a place, say, the size of England, with some of all people, all climates, all scenery, all buildings, all animals, then you can, perhaps, form an idea of this place that I was in. It must all sound very unreal and dreamlike, but believe me, it was only like being in a foreign country and nothing else, except that it was absorbingly interesting. I want to give you a picture of this new land without going too deeply into the minute details. We arrived at length at a huge building, circular and with a great dome. Its general appearance was that of a dome only, on legs. I mean a great dome supported on vast columns, circular and very big. This again, in the interior, was an amazingly lovely blue. It was not a fantastic structure in any way. It was just a beautiful building, as you would have on earth. Do not imagine anything fairy-like. It was not. This blue was again very predominant, and it gave me a feeling of energy. I wanted immediately to write. I would like to have been a poet at that moment, but as it was, I just wanted to express myself with pen and ink. We stayed there some time and had refreshment, very similar, it seemed to me, to what I had always known, only there was no fresh food. Everything appeared quite normal there too, and the absence of some things which would on earth have been present was not noticed. The curious thing was that the meal did not seem at all a necessity. It was there, and we all partook of it lightly, but it was more from habit than from need. I seemed to draw much more strength and energy out of the atmosphere itself. This I attributed to the color of the air. It was while we were in this place that my father explained the reason, and the work of the different buildings I had noted on our walk together. Chapter 3. Interesting Buildings. Looked upon as a meal, a lunch out, it was the longest one I have ever known, and without question the most interesting. I learned a great deal in those first few hours with my father. It was all conversational, but it was of great use to me and of vast interest. He explained to me that the place we were then in was a temporary rest house, one of many, but the one most used by newly arrived spirit people. It was nearest to earth conditions, and was used because it resembled an earth place in appearance. There were other buildings used for the same purpose, as well as for other purposes. By that I mean there's more than one of each. These houses were not all alike. They varied considerably in outward appearance, but there's no need to describe each house. To call it a big building is sufficient, and by that you must understand a place like your museum or your portrait gallery or your large hotels, anything you like, that's near enough. But it was not fantastic in any way, and it had no peculiarities. Therefore, by building, I mean building only. There were a great number of these places in different parts, not grouped together, but variously placed about this land. It seems that all the senses are provided for here. The chief work on the island is to get rid of unhappiness at parting from earth ties, and therefore, for the time being, the individual is allowed to indulge in most of earth's pleasures. There are attractions of all kinds to stimulate and generally to tone up strength. Whatever the person's particular interest on earth has been, he can follow it up and indulge in it here also, for the present. All mental interests and almost all physical interests can be continued here for that one reason of coaxing the newcomer to a level mental outlook. There are houses given over to book study, music, to athleticism of all kinds. Every kind of physical game be practiced. You can ride on horseback, you can swim in the sea, you can have all and any kind of sport which does not involve the taking of a life. In a minor degree that can be had too, but not in reality, that is only make-believe. From this you will understand that particular buildings are given over to their own kind of work. The man who has spent his life in games, heart and soul, would be disconsolate without them here. Well, he can have them here and enjoy them to the full, but he will find that after a time the desire is not so keen, and he will turn to other interests automatically, though gradually, and it may be that he will never entirely abandon his games, but the desire will be less absorbing. On the other hand, the man who used his life for, say, music, for instance, will find his desire, his interest, his ability increasing by leaps and bounds, because music belongs to this land. He will find that by spending much time in one of the music houses, as he will if his life is music, his knowledge and ability are amazingly increased. Then there's the bookworm. He too finds intense satisfaction in his newfound facilities. Knowledge is unlimited. Works of priceless value lost upon earth are in existence here. He is provided for. The keen businessman on earth, whose only interest is in making his business successful, will also find scope for ability. He will come in contact with the house of organization, and he will find himself linked up with work transcending in interest anything that he could have imagined for himself while upon earth. Now, all this is done for a reason. Everyone is provided for. On arriving here, there is often much grief. Grief that is sometimes incapacitating, and no movement forward can be made until the individual wishes it himself. Progress cannot be forced upon him. Thus, in the scheme of creation, the blessed Creator has devised this wonderful means of appealing to the main interest on earth of each one. Everyone comes in touch with the chief longing of earth life and is given opportunity to indulge in it. Thus progress is assured. In all things that are purely and solely of the earth, the interest flags after a little time. A gradual process, nothing is dramatic here, and the person passes from this to another interest, which on earth would be called a mental one. Those whose interests have been in this mind category will continue and enlarge the scope of their work and will progress along the same lines. The others change. Whilst in this blue island, each one is very much in touch with the conditions left behind. At first, there is nothing done but what is both helpful and comforting. Later, there is a refining process to be gone through. At first, it is possible to be closely in touch with the home left behind, But after a little time, there's a reaction from this desire to be so close to the earth, and when that sets in, the process of eliminating earth and flesh instincts begins. In each case, this takes a different course, a different length of time. In trying, thus, to explain the use of this land and its buildings, I have not numbered them Building A for so-and-so, or Building B for this, that, and the other. But in a conversational way, I hope I have helped you to understand and form a general idea of this country and some of its conditions. I hope I have made it clear now, after a time, the desire for earth things leaves us all. It may be a short time or a long time, according to the disposition of the person concerned. Take the athlete. He loves his games, his running, his physical strength, his muscular exercise. Well, he will love it here as much. He will love it here more, because he will find an added pleasure in feeling no fatigue. A sharpened enjoyment altogether, but after a time, his appreciation of all this will change. He will not dislike this hitherto loved sport, but he will pass to a different form of it, a form which is full of movement and satisfaction, but not a physical affair at all. His mind will become more awake, and he will get enormous mental satisfaction from the studies which will come before him concerning the ways and means of travel here. Locomotion of all kinds here is very different to that which obtains in earthly conditions, and this former athlete of earth will drop into line in his new surroundings, and will presently realize that life here is a different thing for him, for though still on the same lines, it holds an increased mental interest. Is that clear? Well, apply it in the same fashion to every other type of individual. End of chapter 3.